Matt Hodges-Long is an expert on building safety. Hi, Matt. How are you?
I'm good, thank you, Julia. Thank you.
Tell me a little bit about the work you do and how it feeds into the cladding story.
Okay, so we help building owners, building managers and residents manage building safety and really sort of manage all of the processes that they have to go through to keep buildings safe. And then one of those that has now occurred in the last few years is understanding what their external walls are made of and what that does to the risk of a building effectively.
When we talk about understanding the external walls, is it the actual fabric of the walls, or is it always something that has been put on the outside of the structure?
It depends how the building's built, but typically the cladding, as people call it, is the external face, the external leaf of the wall. So typically in a modern building, it might be a concrete frame block of flats or a steel frame block of flats. And then a decorative sort of insulating outside leaf will be built around it with the windows in it effectively. And it's that construction. And there's lots of different ways of making the external walls, with different materials and different systems.
And just listening to Alice talking, what is of consequence here is what that is made of, but also how it all fits together, because she was talking about fire breaks. Just talk me through the issues around the material itself and this issue of fire breaks.
Okay, so the material, so what we learned from Grenfell, or became obvious from Grenfell, is that the fire could spread around the external surface of the wall, which in theory it shouldn't do. So that propagated the fire around Grenfell. So that made everybody then the government look again at how does this happen? And they found that there were issues with the building regulations that needed to be addressed. So that's why we've got so many buildings with combustible materials in their external walls. The question is how that's managed. Sorry, Vincent.
No, well, I was just going to ask, when you talk about combustible materials, in the simplest terms, are these materials that should never have been put on there because they don't meet building regulations, or were the building regulations not good enough, which allowed this to happen?
And there's an element of both going on. So significantly, there are still ways in the building regulations for a new building like Alice's at 5 stories to be built with combustible materials. That has not been stopped. Only in taller buildings that's changed. And then there was evidence of potential cheating of the credentials of the materials, so the testing of the materials that went on. So they would have met the regulations at the time if they hadn't cheated. And then there's an element of just wholesale sort of cutting corners and ignoring the building regs. So there's a real mixture that you need to understand in each building as to how that material got on the wall in the first place.
Yeah. So how the material got on the wall, was it tested rigorously enough to demonstrate whether it was safe or not, and also how it's put on with these. Just quickly about the fire breaks. How does that work? What's implied? I mean, it sounds to me as though what's implied here is that there are gaps, which means the fire couldn't jump from one part of the cladding to another.
Yeah, so we talk about compartments. So that's the way that if you imagine a flat as a shoebox, effectively with 6 faces. So one of those faces will typically be the outside wall, and that forms a compartment. So what you're trying to do with the fire breaks is there's a material within the external wall that typically, when it's heated in a fire, will expand and will close the gap and ideally keep the fire within the compartment. So they'll either be permanently closed or they'll be open to let air through and ventilation through, but will only close when they're heated. And it's when they're in the wrong place or they're missing that can cause a problem with or create an opportunity for the fire to spread right the way across the facade of the building.
How many buildings, is it known how many buildings are unsafe in this country?
No, that hasn't been measured. What we do know is that in buildings over 18 metres in height, which if we translate from metres is 6 to 7 stories plus, there have been 2,820 applications to the government fund for fixing building safety problems with cladding. And then below 18 metres, we don't know the number, but typically we think there's about 10 times as many in the 11 to 18 metres category as there are in the 18 metre plus. That would sort of imply potentially about 30,000 buildings with problems at that lower height.
And I don't know if you're able to give us any figures for Kent. Is it possible?
I can. I can give you the application figures for the plus 18 metre buildings in Kent. That's 35 blocks in Kent.
Okay. And are they? Is it possible to see? Are they spread out? Are they all over the place? Presumably they are.
The government don't give
They don't give you any
breakdown of the data. We know of a few in Kent that fit into the 35, but most of these blocks are not publicly known. So it's very hard to actually track and sort of understand the underlying issues with each particular block and how it got itself into a situation of having a perceived or real problem with building safety.
Is it possible there could be another catastrophic fire before this is resolved?
Yeah, I definitely could be. I mean, this is the issue with the external walls, but the big piece of this that people overlook, because everyone's focused on cladding and external walls, is the management of the buildings internally. And the majority of fires will start within a building. So dealing with the external walls won't change smoke propagation around a building. It doesn't protect escape routes necessarily. Smoke vents, emergency lighting, all of these systems within a building all need to be managed and maintained and certified. And most of the attention at the moment is sort of distracted onto external walls, which is important, but it's not the only part of the problem.
So what you're saying, if I'm interpreting correctly, is you could have a building that's potentially a fire risk, but if it had fantastic escape routes, if everything was operating really well internally, it could be safer than another building in the same situation, which didn't have all of those things internally in place to protect people in the event of the worst happening.
That's correct. I mean, the main thing is if everybody can get out, then we're just talking about protecting a property. Then we're talking about damage to inanimate objects, whereas the primary focus needs to be getting people out of the building if there's a problem, if there's a fire. And then we need to look at, can we protect the building for the insurance company or for the residents who, it's hugely inconvenient having to go live somewhere else because you've lost your building to a fire, et cetera, once you've made your family safe. That really is invasive. But I think we're almost losing sight of the protection of people at the moment through all of this obsessive focus on cladding.
So clearly there's two threads here. There's, can you make people safe in the building they live in? And then there's the issue of, what about people who want to move? And at the moment, their property is pretty much worthless because this hasn't been resolved. There's a known issue with the cladding. And that's the situation Alice is, well, she's probably in both situations. There's a safety concern, but there's also the concern about getting things resolved so you can move on with your life. Who should bear the cost of repairing unsafe buildings? Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I think the government, taxpayer, us, all of us.
But that's the point, isn't it? It's not the government's money. It's my money. It's your money. It's everybody's money. So in the end, everybody's going to pay for this, even though it wasn't our fault. Is that right? Or should it fall onto, should there be should somebody be responsible for putting this right? If you built a building that now doesn't look as though it's going to be safe, there's an argument, surely, that that's your responsibility.
Yeah, as the construction company or the designer, yeah, absolutely. But I think what we need to do, rather determining or apportioning liability, is a complex issue, because very rarely is it just one organisation that was responsible for this series of failings that led us to this point. So what the government need to do is bring forward the money to indemnify the innocent victims in all of this, which are the residents and the leaseholders. And then where there's an opportunity to recover some or all of that money through the courts after the building is safe, then that's what the government funding should also look at. And whether that's a levy on new development, there's lots of different ideas being pushed around. But what we're absolutely clear on is that the victims of this crime, if you like, should not be punished for being victims. And that's effectively what the government are looking to do at the moment, is move most of this cost onto the innocent victims of the crisis. So
do you not agree with what I said at the beginning, which is that the BBC understands the government is planning to provide substantial extra funding to help those owners? Is your understanding that it's not that substantial and that people will still end up significantly out of pocket?
I would love to think that the BBC's understanding is the correct one. We haven't seen the evidence of this yet. The rhetoric is still protecting leaseholders from unaffordable costs, rather than protecting and compensating leaseholders for the damage that's been caused to them. So how much, my opinion of how much money is coming forward from the government could be different to theirs. They could add £1 billion to the fund and think that's a lot. I would think that's woefully inadequate. So until we see the numbers, it's very difficult to comment. And the government have been somewhat disingenuous all the way through this process about what was going to happen next. So I'll believe it when I see it, let's put it that way. And I am an eternal optimist. So hopefully they will come through with enough money to fix the issue.
Great to talk to you. Thank you for the brilliant explanations. Matt Hodges-Long is an expert on building safety.